Clint Eastwood, a name that strikes like lightning across 7 decades of cinema. The man who didn't just act in films, but carved himself into the very bedrock of American mythology, with a squint that could stop bullets and a voice that turned whispers into commandments. With his towering presence and the ability to convey volumes in silence, he became more than a movie star. He became the archetype of American masculinity, the last true cowboy in a world that had forgotten what cowboys meant. From the moment he redefined the Western as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's trilogy, cigar clenched between teeth while rewriting justice with gunpowder, to when he showed us that heroes could be broken and still standing in Unforgiven, Clint Eastwood didn't just play characters. He seared them into our collective unconscious with such primal force that we forgot movies could exist without him. He blazed through Hollywood as actor, director, producer, and composer, earning over $7 billion in combined box office receipts, winning 5 Academy Awards, and directing 39 films that transformed entertainment into art. Former mayor, jazz pianist, father of 8 children from 6 different women, the numbers only hint at a life lived without apology or explanation. But behind the steely gaze that defined tough for 3 generations, behind the laconic delivery that made every word feel like gospel, lived a man carrying losses that would have broken someone without his particular brand of iron will. Few ever saw the boy whose father abandoned him during the Depression, the young actor who slept in cars while being rejected by every studio in Hollywood, the father who buried a child to suicide, the director whose final films were made while his body betrayed him scene by scene. Behind those narrowed eyes that promised vengeance or redemption lay nights of bone-deep loneliness, health crises hidden from cameras, and wounds that even the greatest roles could never heal. What transformed Hollywood's ultimate tough guy into a man who admitted he cries when he plays piano alone? How did the figure who epitomized strength and silence spend his 10th decade watching friends, lovers, and his own children precede him into darkness? What you're about to witness is not a tale of Hollywood triumph. It's a raw, haunting journey through endurance, loss, and the price of outliving everyone who knew you before you became a legend. This is the story of how Clint Eastwood transformed abandonment into authority, rejection into revolution, and how at 94 he faces the cruelest enemy of all, being the last man standing in a world that's moved on without him. If Clint Eastwood ever made you believe in justice, if his films ever taught you that sometimes a man's got to know his limitations, leave a like below. Your small gesture is a tribute to the man who showed us that real strength isn't about never falling. It's about always getting back up, even when there's nowhere left to ride. There's a ghost in Clint Eastwood's childhood that he rarely mentions. The sound of his father's car driving away in 1934 when Clint was just 4 years old, leaving behind a family that would spend the next decade chasing work across California like Dust Bowl refugees. Long before the world would know him as Hollywood's ultimate authority figure, he was Clinton Eastwood Jr. in San Francisco, learning that men could disappear and families could survive on nothing but stubborn pride. Clint was born on May 31, 1930, at the height of the Great Depression, weighing 11 pounds 6 ounces, so large the nurses called him Samson. His father, Clinton Sr., was a steel worker when there was steel to work, a salesman when there was something to sell, and absent when there was neither. His mother, Ruth, was a factory worker who learned to pack their entire life into boxes on a moment's notice, following rumors of employment up and down the California coast. The Eastwood family moved 15 times before Clint turned 10, each departure more desperate than the last. They lived in cars, abandoned buildings, migrant camps where privacy meant hanging a sheet between families. Home was wherever we hadn't been evicted from yet, Clint would later reflect in one of his rare admissions about childhood. You learned not to make friends because you'd be gone before their name stuck. The constant upheaval meant Clint was always the new kid, too tall, too quiet, too poor to fit in. He wore the same clothes until they fell apart, ate when there was food, learned that hunger was just another thing you didn't talk about. The abandonment that shaped everything came during one of Clinton Sr.'s longer disappearances. He'd left for work in Sacramento and didn't return for 8 months. No letters, no money, no word if he was alive or dead. Ruth held the family together through factory shifts that started before dawn, leaving Clint to raise his younger sister, Jean. At 8 years old, he was cooking meals from whatever they could afford, usually potatoes, making sure Jean got to school, lying to neighbors about where their parents were. I learned that being a man meant doing what needed doing, Clint would say decades later. Not because you were ready, but because nobody else would. School was sporadic at best. Clint attended at least 8 different schools, each one noting his intelligence, but also his complete disengagement. Teachers called him troubled, distant, unreachable. He was held back in 8th grade, not from inability, but from absence. Too many days working odd jobs to help his mother pay rent. By 15, he stood 6 feet 4 inches, but weighed barely 140 pounds. A scarecrow of a teenager who'd learned that the best way to avoid conflict was to say nothing and look like you might do anything. His mother, Ruth, exhausted and bitter, offered little emotional comfort. When Clint tried to talk about his confusion, his anger at their situation, his fear that they'd always be running, she'd respond with silence or sharp words about gratitude. "We don't complain," she told him. "We endure." That silence became Clint's inheritance, the ability to hold entire conversations with just a look, to convey threat or comfort without words. The boy who learned that fathers could vanish and mothers could break would become the man who trusted no one completely, who kept everyone at arm's length even when holding them close. But first, he had to survive California, and California seemed determined to break him before he could break free. At 23, Clint Eastwood stood outside Universal Studios gates in 1953, having just been rejected for the 7th time that month, told his Adam's apple was too prominent, his speech too slow, and his squint made him look mentally deficient on camera. He'd been discharged from the Army after serving as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord, surviving a plane crash into the Pacific, where he swam 3 miles to shore through shark-infested waters, only to discover Hollywood was a different kind of ocean, filled with different kinds of predators. He was sleeping in a friend's garage in Los Angeles, working nights digging swimming pools for $100 a week, using the money to pay for acting classes he could barely afford. There was no plan B, he would later admit with characteristic minimalism. Either I made it as an actor, or I'd be digging holes until my back gave out. Those first years in Hollywood were exercises in humiliation that would have sent most men back to manual labor. Clint's screen test at Universal in 1954 was a disaster. He delivered lines so woodenly that executives laughed during playback. His contract, when they inexplicably offered one, was for $75 a week, less than he made digging pools. He was assigned to talent development, which meant taking diction lessons to speed up his delivery, dental work to fix his chipped teeth, and acting classes where instructors told him to be more animated, more expressive, more everything you're not. I was invisible, he recalled decades later. Not just unknown, invisible. Like I was a ghost haunting the studio lot. The other contract players called him Clumsy Clint after he knocked over a light during his first scene, causing $3,000 in damage. The rejection was specific and cruel. Directors told him he'd never be a leading man. Too tall at 6 feet 4 inches, too lanky, moved like he was apologizing for taking up space. One casting director famously said, "You've got the charisma of a tree stump and the emotional range of lumber. Maybe try construction." He appeared in bit parts so small they didn't merit credits, playing a lab technician in Revenge of the Creature, a sailor who never spoke in Francis in the Navy. Between these humiliations, he was loaned out for $750 a week, while Universal kept paying him $75, pocketing the difference while he did the work. His breakthrough from invisibility came through television, the medium film actors considered career death. In 1958, he landed the role of Rowdy Yates in Rawhide, after every established actor had passed. The CBS executives wanted him to talk faster, smile more, be more like the typical TV cowboy. Clint refused. "I figured if they fire me, at least I'll be fired for being myself instead of failing at being someone else," he reasoned. The show's producer, Charles Marquis Warren, saw something others missed, that Clint's stillness created tension. His silence made words matter more. But fate's real gift came in 1964, when Sergio Leone, an Italian director nobody in Hollywood respected, offered Clint $15,000 to star in a Western to be shot in Spain, with a script that was barely translated from Italian. Every agent advised against it. Television actors who went to Europe were considered finished. Clint took it anyway, not from vision, but from desperation. His marriage was failing. Rawhide was ending. And at 34, he was aging out of television with no film career to fall back on. He flew to Spain with one suitcase, expecting failure, about to discover that sometimes the biggest breaks come disguised as the worst decisions. The role of the man with no name and a fistful of dollars wasn't supposed to transform Clint Eastwood into an icon. It was a low-budget Italian Western that no American star would touch, directed by an unknown named Sergio Leone, who spoke no English, based on a Japanese samurai film, paying $15,000 for 6 weeks in the Spanish desert. James Coburn had wanted $25,000. Charles Bronson passed entirely. Henry Fonda laughed at the offer. Clint was their last choice, a television cowboy whose own agent begged him not to commit career suicide in Spaghettiland. He had exactly 3 days to decide, his marriage to Maggie Johnson crumbling, Rawhide canceled, and no other options except returning to digging pools. Behind the scenes in Almeria, Spain, Clint was creating a character through subtraction rather than addition. Leone wanted him to play it like a traditional cowboy hero. Clint threw out most of his dialogue, reducing pages of script to looks and gestures. The famous poncho that would become iconic? Clint bought it himself from a Madrid costume shop for $15 because the wardrobe budget was spent. "I figured if I'm going to fail, I'll fail as myself, not as someone's idea of what a cowboy should be," he later explained. The crew thought he was insane, an American TV actor who wouldn't talk, wouldn't smile, just squinted at the camera like he knew something nobody else did. The physical conditions were punishing for a production that could barely afford water. Temperatures hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sets were hastily built facades that sometimes collapsed during takes. Clint performed his own stunts because they couldn't afford doubles, including a scene where he was actually beaten by stuntmen who didn't pull their punches because of language barriers. He lost 20 pounds from dysentery, surviving on rice and bottled Coca-Cola. "Every day felt like career death in slow motion," he confessed years later. "But at least I was dying doing something different." Leone would scream direction in Italian that someone would poorly translate. Clint would nod and do whatever felt right, creating through miscommunication what would become revolutionary cinema. When A Fistful of Dollars released in Italy in 1964, it earned $3.5 million against its $200,000 budget. By the time it reached America in 1967, after legal battles over its similarity to Yojimbo, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a name, he was a phenomenon. The film earned $14.5 million domestically, Critics were baffled, but audiences were mesmerized. The squint that Universal called mentally deficient became the most imitated look in cinema. The slow delivery they tried to fix became the definition of cool. Suddenly, Clint wasn't just employed, he was essential. Every studio that had rejected him was offering contracts. The television cowboy had become cinema's new archetype. But even at this pinnacle moment, Clint felt disconnected from the success. "I had everything I'd been told I wanted," he reflected in a rare, vulnerable moment, "except any understanding of how I'd gotten it. I did everything wrong according to Hollywood, and it worked. That taught me that Hollywood didn't know anything." The success felt accidental, like he'd tricked everyone by being himself when himself was what they'd always rejected. The man with no name had made him famous, but Clint knew he was still just Clint Eastwood Jr. from Oakland, the kid whose father disappeared, now playing disappearing acts on screen. But this time, when he vanished between scenes, he was coming back worth millions. By 1971, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a movie star. He was Hollywood's most bankable director-actor, commanding $1 million per film plus 25% of gross receipts, having transformed from spaghetti western curiosity to American cinema's defining force. That year alone saw him dominate with Dirty Harry, earning $36 million domestically while creating a character so controversial and compelling that "Do you feel lucky, punk?" became cultural scripture. His production company, Malpaso, gave him complete creative control. He owned properties in Carmel, Los Angeles, and Idaho worth $10 million combined. He worked exclusively on his terms. No studio interference, no executive notes, final cut on everything. The television cowboy who couldn't get arrested in Hollywood was now its judge, jury, and executioner, proving that audiences wanted authenticity over acting, presence over performance. But even at the height of this impossible success, Clint was fracturing under pressures he'd never acknowledged publicly. During the filming of Dirty Harry, he was going through a vicious divorce from Maggie Johnson while maintaining a secret relationship with actress Sandra Locke, 14 years his junior. He'd arrive on set at 5 a.m., having not slept, direct and star in scenes requiring emotional control, while his personal life exploded, then spend nights in editing rooms to avoid going home. "I had everything except peace," he would later admit in an unguarded moment. "Success meant I could afford better lawyers and bigger houses to be miserable in." The public saw triumph after triumph. The outlaw Josie Wales earning critical acclaim. Every Which Way But Loose inexplicably earning $85 million with an orangutan co-star. His transition from actor to director with Play Misty for Me, proving he understood cinema beyond just squinting at cameras. But privately, Clint was exhausting himself maintaining multiple lives: the public legend, the secret romantic partners, the father to multiple children from different women who didn't know about each other. He was taking benzos to sleep, amphetamines to work, existing on a chemical seesaw that kept him functional but never present. Working with contemporaries like John Wayne, Lee Marvin, and Charles Bronson, Clint became known as the most efficient director in Hollywood, shooting in sequence, rarely doing more than 2 takes, wrapping films weeks ahead of schedule and millions under budget. What they didn't know was this efficiency came from an inability to stop moving. If he slowed down, he'd have to confront the chaos. William Holden later revealed, "Clint directed like he was being chased." We thought it was artistic vision. Looking back, it was a man running from something. Success is the best revenge until you realize you're taking revenge on yourself, Clint once told his longtime cinematographer, Bruce Surtees. By 1976, at the absolute peak of his powers, Clint Eastwood had directed 8 films, starred in 20, and become mayor of Carmel by the Sea because he was bored. He had more money than he could spend, more women than he could manage, more children than he could properly father. But he also had a growing emptiness that no amount of work could fill, relationships imploding in slow motion, and the dawning realization that he'd become exactly what his father had been, a man who was everywhere except where he was needed. But even at the height of everything, he couldn't stop moving, because stopping meant confronting the ghosts that had been chasing him since that car drove away in 1934. Clint's marriage to Maggie Johnson in 1953 had begun with the desperate optimism of two people who thought respectability could cure loneliness. She was a college student from a stable family. He was a struggling actor who needed someone to believe in him when Hollywood wouldn't. They married 6 months after meeting, Clint earning $75 a week at Universal, living in a one-bedroom apartment in Sherman Oaks where success felt like science fiction. "I thought I'd found my foundation," Clint would later reflect with rare emotional transparency. "But I was building on sand, and we both knew it." The marriage produced 2 children, Kyle in 1968 and Allison in 1972. But by then, Clint had already fathered at least 2 other children with different women that Maggie didn't know existed. The pattern of deception was established early and never broken. While married to Maggie, Clint had a daughter, Lori, in 1954 with an unnamed woman, the child given up for adoption without his knowledge until decades later. He had another daughter, Kimber, in 1964 with dancer Roxanne Tunis. Each relationship overlapped, creating a web of secrets that required constant management. "Love in Hollywood means never having to say you're faithful," Clint once told a friend with bitter humor. The divorce from Maggie in 1984 cost him $25 million. But the real price was the realization that he'd become his father, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Then came Sandra Locke, the relationship that would define and nearly destroy him. They met on The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976 when she was married to someone else and he was still technically with Maggie. For 14 years, they were Hollywood's most visible secret, living together while both maintained other relationships, making 6 films together while their personal life became increasingly toxic. Sandra later claimed Clint forced her to have 2 abortions and get her tubes tied, allegations he never directly denied. When they split in 1989, she sued him for palimony, then fraud, the case is dragging through courts while revealing the brutal mathematics of Clint's emotional life. He'd kept her in a house he owned, directing her career while secretly undermining it, giving her everything except honesty. Between and during these relationships came a parade of others: actress Jean Seberg, swimmer Anita Loest, flight attendant Jocelyn Reeves, with whom he had 2 more children, Scott and Catherine. Each woman discovered the others eventually, creating a network of betrayed partners who compared notes on Clint's patterns. "I collected families like some men collect cars," Clint admitted in a moment of stark self-assessment. "Not because I wanted them all, but because I couldn't let any of them go." The real transformation came with Dina Ruiz in 1996, a television anchor 35 years his junior, who represented his last attempt at conventional happiness. They married, had a daughter, Morgan, and for a moment, it seemed Clint might finally settle into monogamy at 66. But patterns carved over decades don't disappear. By 2013, they divorced, Dina citing the impossible weight of Clint's past, the other children appearing at family events, the ex-partners who remained in his life, the sense that she was just the latest in a series rather than the conclusion. "I needed women to prove I existed," Clint finally admitted to a therapist at age 90. "Every new relationship was evidence I wasn't my father, but I was exactly him, unable to stay, unable to leave, unable to be honest about either." The man who played heroes who always chose righteousness couldn't choose between the women in his own life, leaving a trail of broken promises that no amount of Hollywood success could repair. In November 2021, Clint Eastwood collapsed on the set of Cry Macho in New Mexico, his body finally rebelling against 91 years of relentless motion. The diagnosis revealing atrial fibrillation that had been silently damaging his heart for years. The immediate crisis passed, but tests uncovered a cascade of issues. Severe arthritis in his spine making standing agony, hearing loss so profound he needed assistance to relay direction, vision deteriorating to legal blindness in his left eye. My body decided to present the bill for 9 decades all at once, Clint told his doctor with characteristic understatement. What the public didn't know was that he'd been hiding these conditions for years, directing films through pain that would have hospitalized most people, using body doubles not for stunts, but for simple walking scenes. The exact moment of realization came during a scene where Clint couldn't remember his character's name, staring at the script supervisor with confusion that had nothing to do with acting. Brain scans revealed mild vascular dementia, small strokes that had been occurring unnoticed, each one stealing fragments of memory and cognitive function. I'd been having these episodes, he finally admitted to his son Scott. Moments where I'd forget where I was, what year it was, who people were. I thought it was just being 90. The production bought him time by claiming creative differences needed resolution. But the truth was Clint required daily medical supervision just to continue filming. The physical symptoms had been accumulating for a decade, hidden behind careful staging and Hollywood magic. The famous Eastwood squint was now partially because he couldn't fully open his eyes due to muscle weakness. His voice, that gravelly authority that defined American masculinity, came from vocal cords damaged by decades of cigars and whiskey. He couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes without his legs going numb. During the filming of The Mule in 2018, he'd direct from a wheelchair hidden just outside frame, standing only for his actual scenes, immediately sitting the moment cut was called. The medication regimen required to keep him functional was staggering. Blood thinners for the atrial fibrillation, painkillers for the arthritis, cognitive enhancers for the dementia, medications to counter the side effects of other medications. His longtime physician traveled with him, monitoring vitals that fluctuated dangerously. "I'm a walking pharmacy," Clint observed. "Take more pills than lines now." The insurance companies began refusing to cover his films unless he passed daily medical examinations, treating him less like a director and more like a liability. Recovery wasn't possible. Management was about maintaining dignity while declining. Clint's daily routine became strictly regimented: morning physical therapy to maintain mobility, afternoon cognitive exercises to slow mental deterioration, evening rest that came earlier each day. He could no longer drive, play piano without his fingers cramping, or read scripts without magnification so strong the words looked like billboards. The man who directed films with military efficiency now needed 3 assistants just to navigate a day. "The disease isn't just physical," Clint confessed during what he knew might be his last interview. "It's watching yourself become less yourself every day. I forget my children's names sometimes. I watch my own films and don't remember making them. The worst part isn't dying, it's dissolving." The permanent effects were undeniable. Clint Eastwood, the director who'd made 39 films, could barely remember 30 of them. The actor who'd created iconic characters now struggled to remember their names. The man who'd lived like he was immortal was finally learning what mortality meant, one forgotten moment at a time. The call came at 6:15 a.m. on September 21, 2018, while Clint was reviewing dailies for The Mule in his home office, unable to sleep because sleep meant confronting ghosts. His son Scott's voice was steady but hollow. "Dad, Kyle is gone." Kyle Eastwood, Clint's firstborn son, his jazz musician child who'd inherited his father's artistic soul, but not his demons, had passed away from a sudden cardiac event at age 50. The man who'd spent his life creating his own identity outside his father's massive shadow was dead, leaving Clint to confront the cruelest truth that children aren't supposed to die before their parents, even when their parents are 90. I sat there for 3 hours, Clint would later tell his therapist, trying to understand how I was still here, and he wasn't. Kyle had been the child who understood Clint best, perhaps because he'd chosen music over movies, jazz over Hollywood, creating distance that allowed for actual relationship. They'd played piano together when Kyle was young, before Clint's career consumed everything. In recent years, as Clint's health deteriorated, Kyle had been the one who visited most, who didn't need words to communicate, who could sit with his father in silence that felt like conversation. Kyle knew who I was before I became Clint Eastwood, Clint reflected. He remembered when I was just dad and barely that. The funeral was private, just family and a few musicians from Kyle's band. Clint attempted to deliver a eulogy, but couldn't finish, his voice breaking on the words, "my son," before Scott had to take over. Standing at the graveside, watching them lower his firstborn into the ground, Clint felt something fundamental shatter. You prepare for your parents to die, your siblings, even your spouse, he said. But you never prepare to bury your child. It's against the natural order. It's God's cruelest joke. What the public never knew was that Kyle's death triggered a cascade of losses. Within 6 months, Sandra Locke died from cancer, their bitter history preventing Clint from attending the funeral, but not from grieving privately. 3 months later, his younger brother died. Then longtime collaborators, friends from the Army, people who knew Clinton Jr. before he became Clint. Death became my most reliable co-star, Clint observed with bitter humor. Shows up for every production now. The aftermath revealed the true cost of outliving everyone. Clint became obsessed with his remaining children, calling them constantly, despite not remembering previous conversations due to his progressing dementia. He'd wake at night, convinced Kyle was still alive, searching for his phone number, having to be reminded each time of the loss. The other children, Lori, Kimber, Allison, Scott, Catherine, Francesca Morgan, took turns staying with him, but the guilt was crushing. All those years of divided attention, secret families, being a father in name, but not presence. I had 8 children, Clint confessed during a lucid moment, but I'm not sure I was ever really a father to any of them. Now Kyle's gone, and I can't even remember to mourn him properly. The loss changed his approach to his final years. Clint began writing letters to each child, trying to explain the unexplainable, apologize for the unapologizable. Most remained unsent, his handwriting too shaky to read, his thoughts too scattered to complete. When you live to 94, he said, you don't get a legacy. You get a cemetery of everyone you outlived. Kyle's death wasn't just losing a son. It was accepting that I'd stayed too long at the party. Everyone else had gone home. By 2008, Clint Eastwood sat atop a fortune worth $375 million, owned properties worth $100 million, including the Mission Ranch in Carmel he'd saved from developers, and had just directed 2 back-to-back masterpieces, Mystic River and $1 Million Baby, that earned him universal acclaim. But what the world didn't know was that the 2008 financial crisis had devastated his portfolio, wiping out $180 million in investments overnight, forcing him at age 78 to take directing jobs he didn't want just to maintain liquidity. His restaurant chain failed, costing him $25 million. His production company Malpaso, once Hollywood's most efficient operation, was hemorrhaging money on development projects that would never see cameras. I went from wealthy to working because I had to, Clint admitted to his accountant, At my age, that's not comeback, it's survival. The public transformation was subtle but devastating. Clint began accepting any directing job offered hereafter. Despite not understanding the script, J. Edgar, though he found the subject distasteful, taking Warner Brothers notes for the first time in 40 years because he needed their money. His fee dropped from $15 million to $6 million, then to back-end only, then to hoping the back-end materialized. I went from Clint Eastwood to a director for hire, he observed with characteristic terseness. Same name, different meaning. Behind the scenes, the financial restructuring was heartbreaking. Clint sold his beloved Tehama Golf Club shares at a massive loss. His art collection, including paintings by American masters worth $40 million, went to private collectors who knew he needed immediate cash. The ranch in Idaho, where he'd hidden from Hollywood for decades, sold for $8 million below asking price. He kept only the Mission Ranch, refusing to let developers have what he'd saved, even as maintaining it drained his remaining resources. "I was selling my history piece by piece," he told his son Scott. "Every sale felt like admitting defeat." The survival tactics were humiliating for a man who defined independence. Clint began licensing his image for international commercials, Japanese whiskey, Italian coffee, products he'd never tried. He accepted speaking engagements at corporate events, standing at podiums barely able to see the audience, delivering the same stories about Dirty Harry to executives who weren't born when it was filmed. He directed commercials for Chrysler during the Super Bowl, the Halftime in America ad that everyone praised as artistic vision, but was really a $3 million paycheck he desperately needed. The slow rebuild never truly materialized. Films like The 1517 to Paris and The Mule were financial disappointments, barely covering production costs. Warner Brothers, his home for 50 years, began rejecting his projects, suggesting he might want to consider retirement. Netflix passed on his proposals. Even Malpaso, the company he'd built from nothing, existed now mostly to manage his legacy rather than create new work. "Rock bottom at 90 isn't dramatic," he observed. "It's sitting in meetings where people talk about you in past tense while you're still in the room. It's being treated like a museum piece that occasionally still moves. It's realizing that Hollywood doesn't retire you. It just stops calling, and you keep showing up until you realize nobody's watching." By 2020, the man who'd redefined American cinema was taking any job offered, not from passion, but from the simple need to keep working, because working meant he was still alive, even if barely. By 2023, Clint Eastwood's appearance at the Academy Awards became painful viewing when he struggled to reach the podium, gripping Billy Crystal's arm while his legs trembled with each step, forgetting why he was there until prompted with cue cards he couldn't read. What the public didn't know was that Clint had been battling progressive supranuclear palsy for 3 years, a degenerative brain disorder affecting movement, balance, and cognition, turning the man who'd defined physical authority into someone who needed assistance to stand. "I'm dissolving in public," he told his daughter Morgan after the ceremony. "Every appearance is just documenting my disappearance." The condition meant he could no longer turn his head without turning his entire body, couldn't look up or down without falling, experienced freezing episodes where his body simply stopped responding to his brain's commands. The cognitive decline had accelerated beyond medical predictions. During the filming of what would be his final directing effort, Juror Number 2 inches in 2023, Clint would forget he was directing, asking the crew whose film they were making. He'd watch playback of scenes he'd just shot with no memory of filming them. The assistant director essentially directed while Clint provided his name and presence. Warner Brothers kept this secret, marketing it as Eastwood's possible final film, without revealing it basically was. "He exists but doesn't participate," one crew member revealed anonymously. We're making a Clint Eastwood film without Clint Eastwood. Public speculation about his condition became cruel entertainment. Social media exploded with videos comparing his current shuffle to Dirty Harry's confident stride. Comment sections filled with debates about whether he should be allowed to continue working or should be put in a home. The man who'd created the template for American masculinity was reduced to elder abuse discussions and competency questions. When leaked footage showed him unable to remember the name of his own film during an interview, it went viral with the hashtag #TimeToGoClint trending for days. The isolation had become complete. At 94, Clint had outlived 7 of his 8 children's other parents, most of his collaborators, and every friend from before fame. He spent days in his Carmel home, watching his old films without recognizing himself, asking assistants who the tall man on screen was. His remaining children took turns visiting, but he rarely remembered they'd been there. We perform being a family for someone who doesn't remember having one, Francesca admitted. Every visit is the first visit and the last visit simultaneously. Recent controversies only deepened his tragic trajectory. His political comments at empty chairs had evolved into actual conversations with people who weren't there. He'd been found wandering Carmel's streets at 3 a.m., looking for the mayor's office he'd occupied 40 years earlier. The police knew to call his assistant rather than create incidents. His final film premiered to empty theaters, critics reviewing it as an obituary rather than cinema. "I've become a ghost story," Clint said during a moment of clarity. "The scary tale Hollywood tells about staying too long. I'm still here, but everyone's already written my ending." The man who directed 39 films could no longer direct himself to the bathroom. The icon who'd created American cinema's most memorable moments couldn't remember any of them. At 94, Clint Eastwood had achieved the cruelest fate possible, living long enough to watch himself become a memory while still breathing. Today, at 95, Clint Eastwood lives not as the towering figure who redefined American cinema, but as a man discovering that the cruelest fate isn't dying, it's outliving everything that made you who you were. From the abandoned boy in Depression-era California to the icon who taught us that justice comes at sundown. His journey reminds us that our toughest heroes are often the loneliest, that those who seem invincible are simply better at hiding their mortality, and that sometimes the price of becoming a legend is forgetting you were ever human. He rises each morning in his Carmel home, if morning has meaning when time has lost structure, helped by nurses who dress someone who no longer understands clothing, feed someone who forgets he's eating, guide through routines that exist without purpose. His daily existence is managed with medical precision, medications for the palsy, painkillers for arthritis that makes existing agony, cognitive exercises that slow but cannot stop the erasure. His net worth, still roughly $200 million, ensures perpetual care, but cannot purchase what's been lost. Recent attempts at filming have ceased entirely. Insurance companies refuse coverage, studios politely decline projects, and Clint himself no longer remembers wanting to direct. What brings fleeting peace now are moments too small for legacy. The sound of jazz piano that makes him smile, though he can't remember playing. Ocean waves visible from his window that he watches without knowing why they matter. His remaining children creating new memories he won't retain, but finding meaning in the attempt. The Mission Ranch he saved from developers still operating, though he doesn't remember owning it. Sometimes he asks to visit that nice restaurant, not knowing it's his, sitting at tables where strangers recognize him, but he recognizes nothing. The universal message woven through Clint's story speaks to anyone who has lived long enough to become a stranger to themselves, who has achieved everything only to forget what they achieved, who has discovered that sometimes the hardest role isn't the hero or villain, It's the audience to your own disappearance. His journey tells us that our worth isn't measured in our longevity, but in what we leave behind, that our legacy isn't just the art we create, but the lives we touch, and that sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing death, but facing the dissolution of everything you were before death arrives. To those watching who are caring for parents disappearing into themselves, the adult children who introduce themselves daily to someone who changed their diapers, the spouses who love someone who no longer knows love exists, the friends visiting someone who sees only strangers. Clint's story is your story too. You are not alone in grieving someone whose body remains, in feeling guilty for wanting it to end, in wondering if the person you're caring for would want this. Your exhaustion is valid, your grief is real, and your presence matters even when it seems meaningless. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which Clint Eastwood film defined your understanding of strength, which character taught you about justice or redemption. Leave a like, not just for the legend, but for the human being who showed us that even cowboys get scared. Subscribe to hear more stories of icons who remind us that immortality is an illusion, and that sometimes the most heroic act is simply continuing to exist when existence has lost all meaning. Thank you, Clint, for showing us that real men do cry, for proving that silence can speak volumes, and for teaching us that sometimes there's no sunset to ride into. Sometimes there's just another day of forgetting what sunsets meant. Your story doesn't end with triumphant music or one last shootout. It continues with each breath drawn by a body that outlasted its purpose, surrounded by people loving someone who no longer exists, proving that the hardest thing isn't dying, it's being the last one to leave the theater after the credits have rolled.